Welcome to the Hope for the Animals podcast, a project of compassionate living. I'm your host, Hope Bohannic, and today we're joined by a fantastic photographer, author, and storyteller, Isabella La Rocca González. But before we get into the interview, I have a couple of announcements. So, we are getting to the end of the year. And just as I have the last couple of years of this podcast's existence, I'm going to take a little break from posting episodes over the holidays. This will likely be the last episode of the year, and then I'll resume in January. But we now have over 100 episodes. This is episode 109. So there's a lot to explore. If you haven't heard them all, this might be a great time to scroll back, find an old episode or two that you haven't heard and might be of interest to you. But I will be back with new interviews and episodes in January, in the new year. The other announcement is also about this coming year, 2025. I have a couple of new projects with Compassionate Living that you might be interested in. One is very exciting. We will be organizing a Eugene Vegan Fest in Eugene, Oregon on May 4th, 2025. So if you are in the Pacific Northwest, or if you've ever wanted to visit Eugene, Oregon, this might be the time. So mark your calendars and join us on May 4th for the Eugene Vegan Fest. The other announcement is that Compassionate Living's Ahimsa Living Project is going to be launching a new ongoing event in the new year. So, Compassionate Living has three main projects, this podcast being one of them, the Hope for the Animals podcast. The other is the Humane Hoax Project, and that, of course, has to do with my book and our website, humanehoax.org, and our team that works very hard to get the message out about the humane hoax. And the third project is our Ahimsa Living Project. So, ahimsa is a Sanskrit word. It means nonviolence or non harming. And we're going to be starting a monthly spiritual vegan online gathering. We're calling it the Ahimsa Living Circle, and it will start in January. So, if you are a spiritually leaning vegan, particularly if you're interested in the Dharma traditions, you may enjoy this circle, this gathering. It will be on the second Saturday of the month. So the first one's going to be January 11th, and then ongoing every second Saturday of the month. My husband Kojin and I will be hosting, and it's in collaboration with Arihanta Institute. Arihanta is an online Jain academic institution that we have been partnering with for a while now. I taught a class with them a couple years back, and Kojin is an assistant professor there. And I'm helping them with their new vegan studies initiative as well. But this is not a class. This will be a casual spiritual sangha, a gathering of spiritual people open to anyone interested in the intersection of spirituality, veganism, Jainism, the Dharma traditions, and living nonviolently. If you would like information about this new Ahimsa Living Circle that starts in January, be sure to sign up for Compassionate Living's e-newsletter. We will be sending out announcements about it. And you can also just email me and ask about it, and I can get you on the list. There is a link in the show notes to Compassionate Living's website to get on our e-news list. Okay, so let's jump into our conversation today with Isabella. I love this book. I really have to say, her new book, Censored Landscapes, it's beautiful. It really is. I am a big fan of this book. It's different. It's different than just your typical book that you sit and you read and you're just getting a bunch of information. It's more diverse than that, more multimedia. It's got captivating photography, these short segments, like short personal stories, poems. I'm really excited to share this conversation with you about this book. It's really a work of art. It's published by Lantern Publishing and Media, the same publisher that did my anthology, The Humane Hoax. So let's now hear all about it. So today we have Isabella La Rocca González. She is an award winning artist, author, activist. She is the daughter of immigrants from Mexico and Italy, and she strives to reconcile the values of her Indigenous roots with her European heritage. Her photography has been exhibited internationally, including a solo show at the Center for Photography in Woodstock, New York. And she was awarded the Ferguson Grant from Friends of Photography in San Francisco, California, for excellence and commitment to the field of photography. She received her BA in Fine Arts from the University of Pennsylvania and her MFA in photography from Indiana University. Welcome to the podcast, Isabella.
Thank you so much, Hope, and thank you for having me. I'm so excited to discuss this book with you. I love your podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, I'm excited to talk about this book as well that you have written because it is fantastic. But before we get there, we like to get to know you a bit. And so we want to hear your vegan origin story. Why and when did you go vegan?
Okay, well, it was a very long journey. I went vegetarian as a teenager when I read two books that impressed me a lot as a teenager. One was The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. And even though it was really about immigrants and their plight, just the knowledge of what was going on with the animals really horrified me. And I also read Diet for a Small Planet, and it just seemed like, of course, why should we be eating animals? But I only went vegetarian. I didn't know any other vegetarians or vegans. In fact, I didn't know any vegetarians. I didn't even know about veganism until the 90s, which was, like a couple few decades later.
Yeah, so I was going to ask, so
Um,
that was the 80s that you went vegetarian?
no, that was the 70s. I
The
was a teenager
70s.
in the 70s.
Wow.
Yeah.
Amazing. I love it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, my vegan diet, makes me look a little younger than my years,
Yeah,
maybe.
but so few people knew even what vegan was, in the 70s. So, yeah.
Oh yeah. I mean, and by the 80s, I think it was more widespread, but I didn't know anyone. I hadn't really heard of it until the 90s. And it was from one friend who kind of used the word in a derogatory way, which didn't impress me one way or another. She was complaining about she had thrown a barbecue, and then she said, and then the evil vegans came and ruined it. And, and I just thought that was hilarious. Like, how could vegans be evil? Like, it just seemed like such a contradiction in terms.
Right.
But I didn't think much of it. I didn't think about my diet very much until I stumbled across a PETA video called Meet Your Meat. And that was the beginning of the end for me. I was so horrified. And I started looking into all the different foods and doing those mental gymnastics that a lot of people do of, well, maybe this is humane and maybe this isn't so cruel and maybe Parmesan cheese from Italy is fine. And of course,
Uh-huh.
none of that is true. And the more I looked into it, and it was actually, I think it was 2008 when the Humane Society kind of launched the whole Prop 2 thing in California.
Yeah.
That it was a ballot initiative that would make it illegal for these facilities to not allow their animals to
It
turn
was kind of
around.
it was the first attempt at cage free and kind of crate free legislation, and the way they worded it was that the animals could stand up, turn around, and spread their wings.
Exactly. Or
Yeah.
limbs. Yes.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, I'm going to work on that. That seems like a good thing. And I was out there, gathering signatures. And two things struck me because of that. One, that I was a horrible hypocrite because at that time I was still eating fish. I
Mm.
had cut out everything else, but for some reason, I really still thought that fish was really nutritious and I needed it. And so at that point, I was like, no, that's it. No more. I'm not going to be this hypocrite trying to justify this unjustifiable behavior.
Mm.
And then the other thing that struck me is I don't want them to be able to stand up, turn around, and spread their wings and limbs. I want them not to be exploited at all.
Yeah.
So that was the end for me.
Yeah.
That was 2008, and I just stopped any kind of consumption of animals. My only regret is that I did not do it much, much, much earlier.
Isn't that always what every
Yes,
vegan says?
I know.
I don't
I know.
regret, I don't miss cheese, I don't regret anything. The only thing I regret is that I didn't do it sooner. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I
Yeah.
remember Proposition 2 well. I was the Sonoma County coordinator for Proposition 2 back in the day, collecting the signatures for that very early legislation initiative. And yes, it's fascinating the trajectory of all that and how it is now moved into actual like slaughter bans and large scale animal agriculture bans that are trying to work their way through legislation now. So fascinating stuff. And
Yeah.
and it does bring in, you're right. I mean, I think that was the what I felt was the best thing that came out of it, really, not the legislation itself, but
Hmm.
just people being awareness being brought to a broader swath of people and people like yourself, actually activists getting deeper in and more involved. So yeah, yeah.
Exactly. I think without that, without having worked on that, it might have taken me longer.
Mm.
And I think, I was out there gathering signatures and telling people, and, I was really passionate about it. So I think that just that really spread awareness in a way that is really difficult to do.
Yeah, yeah, agreed. There's debate around the legislation and if it's, an effective strategy, but it certainly does bring people in and get the message out. So, there's debate there, but we're debating on how the best way to reach people are all the time. And I think one of the best ways is through stories. And so you have created a book that definitely does that. And so you have written a book called Censored Landscapes: The Hidden Reality of Farming Animals, and it's coming out with Lantern Publishing and Media, fall of 2024. So it is out now, and this is really a beautiful book with photographs and stories and poems and facts also about the lives of farmed animals. You also have a segment or a snippet from the jungle, which you mentioned. That's really cool that you were able to bring that in as well, since that was an early inspiration for you. And we lived in the same area, kind of Northern California area, pre-pandemic. We've both left the area since, and you're now in Kentucky. But I love that the book opens with and was kind of inspired by the Turlock rescue in 2012 in Turlock, California. This was a mass rescue of thousands of hens that were confined for their eggs, that just mobilized the animal advocacy community in the area to come together, because it happened so fast and people just had to kind of drop everything and go to try to get these thousands of hens out of these buildings. And you had photographs of that day in here in the very beginning of the book, and it really brought back memories for me of that day, the stench and the sadness from that rescue. Tell us about how this book came about and maybe a little about your connection to that rescue.
Yeah, well, first of all, good on you for having been part of the rescue. I didn't go out there actually until a year later. I kind of knew about it, just kind of heard on the periphery, but I wasn't very involved with an animal sanctuary at the time. And I decided, I've got to go out there and explore this for myself. Like many people, I had not had much exposure to farmed animals or any of that. I didn't grow up around any farms. And I think I knew enough to know that there was intensive confining going on and a lot of cruelty, but I really needed to see for myself. And as a photographer, I use my camera as a way of exploring the world and understanding the world. So I thought, I'm going to go out there, I'm going to photograph this.
Well, I'll tell you the photograph that really struck me is the one that you took of underneath the building. That was the view that most of us had because during the rescue, only those that were kind of in like the hazmat suits were able to go inside because it was the stench was so overwhelming and so awful.
Mhm, mhm.
And it was just so dirty and disgusting. But you they went up a series of stairs, and where we were outside, you could see that underneath of the building, and you have a shot of that underneath with just all of the muck and feathers and gross. And it's interesting that that was a year later because it looked just like it did that day, and just realizing what kind of filth these birds lived in. So you
Oh,
really captured it. I can't believe it was still that awful, a year later.
and the smell. There was
Was it still
still the
there?
lingering smell of
Ah,
ammonia a year
oh,
later. And the where I call them warehouses, the doors were open, so it wasn't like it was enclosed that whole time.
wow.
So yeah, it was I mean, even before the birds were abandoned, that was just a hellhole of a place.
Yeah.
And like so many other places like that.
And what you're talking about is that the farmer had abandoned the birds, like stopped feeding them, stopped giving them water for, I think it was like weeks, days or weeks. And animal activists found out about it and got permission to go in and rescue the birds, but they had been without food or water for, or any kind of care. Not that they get care, but yeah. So they had been abandoned for, I think, weeks. Yeah.
2 weeks
Two
until
weeks.
state officials found them, and there were 17,000 survivors at that point. And then the state officials started gassing them.
Oh,
So it was the animal sanctuaries that came in and said, "Oh, please, let us rescue." And I think it was 4,470. I may have that number wrong, but
yeah.
because of animal sanctuaries, over 4,000 birds were rescued.
Right, right. Around 4,000. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Wow.
Thank goodness for animal sanctuaries.
Yes. Yeah. Well, this book is really fantastic. That this is kind of where it begins is with this rescue, but you go into so many different and varied emotions. But I do want to read just a short segment to give kind of a taste of this book. Okay, so I'm going to read this little bit. Birds can fly in the sky, unassisted by metal structures or fossil fuels. They're emblematic of freedom. Free as a bird, goes the cliche. For her whole life, each of those hens has been crammed into rusted cages with three, four, five, or six others. Her whole life eclipsed by an obsessive desire to burst out of the cage, to spread her wings and feel the sun and the rain and the breeze, to sashay on the ground under an open sky and make a nest and raise her babies. And what I love about this is that, as vegans, as animal advocates, we tell the story over and over. We tell the story of the suffering of the hens in the egg industry, and we try to find the words and we try to find the feeling of it. But, you've found a way to make it fresh, to make it visceral, combined with all these wonderful photographs, and your prose is beautiful. I just really think this is such an excellent book. Why did you want to write this book?
Oh, well, I mean, I'm a photographer, and I think when I went vegan, I was actually going through a really hard time in my life. I had just gone through a divorce, and I was really questioning life, and my purpose in life. So when I went vegan, I felt very deeply that if I could make just some small change that would help the billions and billions of animals that are exploited, bred, slaughtered, I would have lived a good life.
Mm.
And I've been a photographer since I was a teenager. I studied art, I taught art for almost 30 years, and I wanted to use all of my talents, gifts, skills in the service of this purpose.
Yeah.
So when I photographed that facility in Turlock, I thought, I need people to see what these places are like. I need people to know, that in fact, sometimes they may be driving by them and they're not even aware that there are tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of sentient animals locked inside of these places, made invisible. And I wanted to visibilize them in some way, even though you don't see them. I wanted to make their presence known
Mm.
using my photography and using my words.
Yeah, and it's kind of like a coffee table type book, right? That's, a little larger, I don't know how you would say it, but like wider
Yes.
than your typical book, so that the photographs can be more vivid and more engrossing, I think, because they are really wonderful photographs. And you talk about photography at the beginning of the book, about its importance. So I'd love to just have you talk a little more about that. I know that you took these photos. What was it like taking the photos? And we've been talking a lot actually on the podcast the last few. I'm thinking of Thomas Makowitz and some of the others, people that I have interviewed recently, talking about the importance of storytelling, right? To get the message out. And photography is such a powerful way to tell a story. Do you want to talk a little more about that?
Sure, yeah. I love landscape photography. I have really, really loved, the beginnings of American landscape photography. I don't know now if Ansel Adams is as famous as he was, maybe 20 years ago, but when I was studying photography and even teaching, everybody knew who Ansel Adams was. And they even knew who Carlton Watkins and all these great landscape photographers who really kind of laid the foundation for the tradition of landscape photography in the United States. But, as we know, our history has been skewed in favor of white men. And the photography that these men did left out a lot, including the fact that Indigenous people were living in this country, and that it was not a pristine landscape. It was the home of people. So they were kind of maybe inadvertently perpetuating that myth. And then there was also a movement in the 70s to kind of make landscape photography more real and include the human interventions in the landscape. The new topographics exhibition was just groundbreaking. But the fact is that 9 of the 10 photographers were men and none were people of color. And animal agriculture was just not part of it. Any kind of non-human animals was just not part of what was considered the landscape.
Mm.
So I felt that I really wanted to represent the parts of our culture that had been excluded from landscape photography. And I'm a kind of a techno freak. I set up my tripod and I made these, super long tonal range photographs and really went all out in that direction. And I didn't do anything illegal. In the places that I photographed, there were no ag gag laws like there are in some places, and I did not trespass very much.
Mm.
I obeyed the signs and things like that.
But
But
but you
still,
did
no
move
one is
in it.
welcome in these places.
Right. And so you did get kind of did you get actually approached and asked to leave?
Oh, it wasn't quite that polite.
Oh, oh no.
Uh, yeah, there was one particular incident where this man just was yelling at us and tried to block my car in with his truck, threatening us. I had to kind of maneuver my car out of his way, and just we took off, and he followed us for a while. He was very belligerent, even though we weren't doing anything illegal, and he was verbally assaulting us. But out in these places, also law enforcement is always going to be on the side of the farmers.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, and so it was not a polite exchange at all
Wow.
on their part.
My goodness. Well, it paid off. the uh the work you did, and it's a really beautiful book. So you actually use both color and black and white photography. Can you talk about the difference or why you chose to use one and the other in different places?
Yes, I used color for the landscapes. I don't think that the detail of these banal warehouses and facilities would have come across as strongly in black and white.
Mm.
Um, and to differentiate the animals I photographed from belonging in those facilities, I made them in black and white. Also, because black and white in the history of photography has had this sort of artistic respect that color has not enjoyed as much, even to this day. People kind of look at black and white photographs and think, ooh, that's arty, you know. And so I wanted to draw on all of that history when making those portraits of those animals.
Yeah, and I think portraits in black and white, I mean, besides being kind of artsy or,
Yes,
that signal, it also there's just something very I think that when I look at black and white photography, I think it's kind of like deeper somehow. I can't explain, but like it's just not real. It's not the reality. It's not your eyes. It's something different. It's something deeper and captures something different about that person or
that's
or that
that's a
animal.
beautiful insight, Hope.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. That's it kind of elevates it, still real, but kind of a step up from reality, and it kind of separates it in a way that emphasizes the form and the expression rather than too much going on.
Yeah. 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 Beautiful. And animals are people. So uh
Yes.
captured the personhood of these animals. So there's an interesting part in the book. So you go into a lot of different aspects of animal farming and different things and personal stories as well. And in one of those areas, one of those personal stories that you had, it's a part called decolonize, re-indigenize. And you talk about your family and how your parents were immigrants and you moved around a lot as a kid, and how Indigenous people of North and Central America didn't farm animals. They did not farm animals. So confining and farming animals is a European colonial import. I think people don't realize this or don't think about this, and it's really important. Would you want to share a bit about this part and how it related to your life and to your veganism?
Sure, yeah. My mom was Mexican, and I was very close to my mom's family growing up. I spent summers at my grandmother's house in Juarez. I was always very curious about my indigenous roots and talked to my grandmother, who was more knowledgeable about her indigenous roots than many of the other side, which may have been more European. What I know
Because
is
your
that
father was Italian, is that right?
correct. Yeah,
Okay.
my father was Italian. He was in the Italian Air Force when he was in his 20s, and they were stationed in Fort Bliss, Texas.
Hmm.
And so, the Italian guys, they felt more comfortable around the Mexican girls because there's more similarity in the language and
Oh,
in the culture. So the guys would go across the border and, kind of meet the girls over there. And that's how my parents met.
ah,
And
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's quite a cultural mixture. Like many Mexican people, part of my roots are colonizers and part of my roots are indigenous.
Mm,
Um, so I've had to make peace with all of those clashing cultural influences.
yeah.
But with the indigenous side, like many indigenous people with indigenous roots, our history has been erased. And so part of what's been erased is that there were very advanced civilizations in the Americas and very advanced methods of agriculture. Cows, pigs, sheep, chickens, and goats are not native to the United States. They
Right.
were brought by the Europeans.
Yeah.
So this was of great interest to me, especially because of all the myths surrounding veganism, that it's a white, thing that white people are trying to impose on people of color, which we know is not true. The fact is that now more progressive methods of agriculture are discovering that the indigenous people knew much more about what they're now discovering or purporting to discover are more harmonious methods of agriculture. And
Mm.
part of that is not farming animals.
Yeah, like the Three Sisters, planting plants that do well together.
Oh, yeah. And agroforestry, mounds in especially wet areas so that the water drains off, or really using the water rather than irrigation. Just all sorts of methods that were kind of lost to colonization.
Yeah, and that most indigenous cultures were primarily plant-based. I mean, they did hunt or fish, but that was a minimal part of the diet. Mostly it was gathering and planting and plant-based. Yeah,
Correct.
yeah,
Absolutely correct. And if you look at many indigenous cultures all over the United States, many of them have been mostly plant-based, if not all plant-based. At the time, there were places in the world where there were parts of the year where you could not grow crops. And at that time, then there was subsistence hunting. But for the most part, most older cultures are mostly plant-based, certainly much more plant-based than our current sad American diet.
yeah, the standard American diet.
Yes.
Very sad. Sad for a lot of beings, not only humans, but sad for the animals too.
And sad for the planet. It's
Yeah.
just sad all around.
Yes. Well, let's move on to another interesting section that you called grass-fed greenwashing. And this, of course, interests me because of my nonprofit work with our Humane Hoax Project, my nonprofit's Humane Hoax Project. Can you tell us what you touched on in this segment and why?
Oh, yeah. This is, I get a little hot under the collar when I think
Yeah,
about
me
this.
too.
It's just because it's such a lie
Yeah.
that um, grass-fed, and we can lump a lot of other rhetoric in there, pasture raised and free range that have absolutely no meaning. But the grass-fed thing has really taken hold. There's the holistic grazing management terminology that they use, or the regenerative agriculture terminology. And there's this myth that somehow grazing domesticated cattle is going to mitigate or, in fact, totally reverse climate change. And it's such a hoax, as you know, Hope. It's just a complete and total greenwash. I focused on Alan Savory, who did a 2013 TED Talk in which he proposed that his holistic management could reverse climate change. Now, this is a rancher who was responsible for the extermination of 40,000 elephants, 5 to 10% of all the elephants in the world in Africa. purportedly because it was going to reduce desertification. He is a rancher. He makes his riches from grazing cattle and has for a long time. So of course, he's going to trot out this theory that grazing domesticated cattle is somehow going to save us. And so a lot of ranchers have jumped on board, and the regenerative agriculture movement has been co-opted by ranchers at this point. When you use the word regenerative these days, many people immediately associate that with ranching. And I do want to say that there are methods in the regenerative agriculture movement that are quite positive. Composting, for example. But
Yeah,
at this
the
point,
plant part, the regenerative plant farming is really great. It's just
sure,
when you add
yeah,
the animal in that we have problems.
exactly. The problem is at this point, many people, if maybe the majority of people who even consider themselves environmentalists, think that an essential part of regenerative agriculture is grazing domesticated cattle, which has been widely debunked, by many scientists and analysts. And those who claim that it's effective are ranchers, of course. And it's a small part of the beef industry. And of course, they have an interest in keeping this lie going.
Well, I'm really grateful that you added this into the book. I think it's, really, really important for us to be aware of now. To me, it's kind of our 21st century activist challenge, the new challenge, right? Because so much of the labeling and marketing is moving towards these supposedly better ways. But of course, as we know, there's no right way to do the wrong thing. So so I appreciate that you included this segment.
Oh yeah, I can't tell you how strongly I feel about it. It really gets under my skin knowing that people who consider themselves environmentalists are putting forth these blatant lies.
Yeah, yeah, it's very frustrating. Well, hopefully the truth will prevail, and hopefully your book will be part of bringing that truth to light. So thank you for including that. So one last thing I would love to touch on, and you touch on it briefly in the book in another section, and that's kind of around the economics of farming animals and subsidies and the money that the government is putting into propping up agriculture, animal agriculture. And now we're seeing these, mass killings of chickens because of avian flu, and then the government will swoop in and give these industries tons of money just for killing all their chickens. It's such a bizarre system in the economic sense. Did you want to talk a little about that?
Sure, yeah. I think this is, as you said, Hope, a very timely subject just because, in the last couple years, 100 million chickens have been, as they put it, depopulated.
Yeah.
The government has spent over $1 billion of our tax money paying these, I'm going to use the word livestock because that's what they call themselves, livestock operators, to supposedly euthanize or depopulate, which are, euphemistic terms for what they do. And the methods they use are incredibly cruel. They either cook them alive in the barns or they gas them in these carts, both of which are horrendous deaths.
Right. And how it's not a literal cooking, but they will shut down all the ventilation
Exactly.
and close all the doors, and it heats up the, just and just no ventilation, and they actually heat up so much that they die of like heat prostration, heat overheating. So yeah, it is like they're cooking to death. It's got to be a horrible death.
Horrible, horrible. And in some ways, the government is incentivizing these companies to continue business as usual, these intensive confinement methods, these cruel caging or overpopulated ways of farming by paying them 100% of the costs of, killing these animals to prevent avian flu, which is most likely spread most through these methods. So it's this horribly
Yeah.
vicious cycle.
And it comes from that industry. I mean, the only reason that we're having an avian flu epidemic is because of farming birds. So it's just, yeah, like you said, a vicious cycle.
Exactly. And the problem is that in our current democratic system, money is power. It's much more powerful than speech or citizenship or anything else. And for a legislator to remain in office, they have to go after donors, and lobbyists hold a lot of sway. And the animal agricultural business has a lot of power in our government. And so it's very, very difficult to turn this thing around because those who are profiting from these animals have a lot of power to keep profiting from these animals. The US government subsidizes this industry to the tune of about $2 billion a year, and yet only a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of that, like 0.5%, is put towards alternative proteins, non-animal based proteins. And a tiny percent is put toward fruits and vegetables. I think one year it was 4%. In 2020, it was 2.5%.
Right.
So the government is actually holding up this industry, making these products unrealistically cheap.
Yeah. And that's why I know that people are really into these legislative changes. We talked about them earlier. To me, I feel like relying on government and legislation it's just so difficult. It's such an uphill battle and so flimsy. Everything can be overturned so quickly. That's why I feel so strongly that it has to be a grassroots movement. It has to be a grassroots effort. And we have to, as individuals, boycott the industry. I think people forget that veganism is actually a boycott. It is a boycott of meat, dairy, and eggs. It's a boycott of an unjust and horrible industry, an unsustainable industry. And consumer boycotts are very powerful. We've gotten a lot done in the past with consumer boycotts. So yeah, I like to remind people that, this is a boycott.
And it has been effective. Hope, I mean, even since I became vegan, and certainly since you've been vegan, we've seen a sea change in the culture.
Yeah.
We've seen a huge change in the attitudes and the knowledge about the animal agricultural industry and the possibility that it is possible not to exploit animals and be healthy and thrive.
Yes, it's true. And I appreciate those positive thoughts. We have come so far, and longtime vegans like you, like me, we can see it so much more, the progress that we've made. I love that you have been vegetarian since the 70s. That is incredible. So, on that note, on that positive note, let's go with the last question. What gives you hope for the future?
What gives me hope for the future? Well, you do. All vegans give me hope. You give me
Yes.
hope.
Oh.
Sorry to use your name. Just the fact that there are so many good people who are working so hard and so passionately and who understand that this system must change, and it will. I am 100% sure that it's going to change. It has to change. There is no way that we can keep living as we have and exploiting other animals on Earth and continue surviving, much less thriving.
I'm so grateful that you have 100% surety. That's wonderful. That gives me hope, that you're so sure. And I am too. I'm hopeful as well. I can see a beautiful future, and I hope that we can create it. And part of creating that is telling stories, telling the stories of the animals, what happens to them, and you have really created what I feel it's a masterpiece. I love this book. It is a beautiful book. I feel like I want to give one to everybody I know. Uh
Oh, me too.
yes. It is incredible. And with the holidays coming up, I think it's a beautiful holiday gift. So, thank you for writing it. Thank you for putting it together, and thank you for being on the podcast.
Well, thank you, Hope, and thank you for everything you do for all animals.
Thank you for listening to the Hope for the Animals podcast, a project of compassionate living. I really feel that this book, Censored Landscapes, it would be such a great gift. It's such a good, I think, gift book with the holidays coming up, maybe getting it for a family member, a friend who has shown some interest in veganism. It's available from Lantern Publishing and Media. Please support them. They're an incredible publisher, animal focused, environmental focused publisher. And I'll put a link to where you can buy the book from Lantern in the show notes. So I encourage you to support it, get it, pass it along on social media. That helps as well. And speaking of that, if you could share this episode on your social media networks, that would be fantastic. This would be a great one to share. And if you are listening on an app, please scroll down and give us that 5-star rating. Maybe write a review. That helps so much. That will help me. It will help Isabella for us to get our passion projects out to the world. And as I mentioned in the beginning, I will be taking a break from posting through the rest of the year, through the holidays. I will be back in action with more episodes in January. I hope you have a lovely holiday season, a good, cozy end of the year, however you celebrate. Please keep the animals always in mind and live vegan.